Hello,
Hi.
Miriam, it's wonderful to see you.
Mhm.
And I'm Karen Carnabucci, for those of you who don't know me. And I'm here to interview Miriam Zachariah, who is going to be a force of wonderfulness at our upcoming conference, the conference sponsored by the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama, happening April 2nd to 7th in Los Angeles, California. Miriam, you are going to be offering the keynote
Mhm.
for the conference, as well as offering a pre-conference workshop and a
Mhm.
workshop during the conference itself.
Mhm.
And you're going to be receiving an award, the first award named after your mother, Regina
Mhm.
Moreno, for educator and all that you have done to promote sociometry in education.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So education is a really interesting topic nowadays because we hear so many teachers are frustrated in the school system
Mhm.
and so much is happening in the educational system. You do sociometry and you do community building.
Mhm.
Tell us about what educators need to know about sociometry and how it can really change the atmosphere in the classroom
Mhm.
and in the school in general.
Yeah, I mean, sociometry can always be done and will always help, right? I tell teachers a lot, because I still go into schools. I'm now a retired principal for since June of 2020. However, I still work as what one would call an occasional principal. So when principals are sick or on leave, or vice principals, assistant principals, you would say in the US, I'm going in and replacing them sometimes for several weeks, sometimes for a day or two here and there. So I get a lot of opportunities in that role to do a lot of mentoring of existing administrators and of teachers. And I will say to them that we can't replace. The reality is that we're kind of falling apart as a system, and one of the signs of that is a lack of resources in terms of people. There's a scarcity, so there are more and more children in classrooms. There are fewer special education assistants. There are fewer um, secretaries. There are fewer custodians. There are fewer of all of the kind of support systems that kind of make the system work. However, when you're in that situation, still what you're looking for is an understanding of the group you're working with, because we learn in groups. We always learn in groups. The school system, the school itself, the adults in the school are a sociometric group. The students in the school are a sociometric group. The students in each classroom are a sociometric group. And understanding the sociometry of those groups is going to make things so much easier than trying to deal with them individually, right? That's sort of like, oh my God, I have 30 plus kids in my classroom and I have to manage this huge span of needs. For a teacher is just overwhelming, right? It's like, how could I possibly, as the one adult in this room, be able to meet all these needs? And while that is a very valid concern and very real, one of the ways to mitigate that is to build a sociometric community in your classroom where students are supporting each other. And one of the ways, and understand and are safe with what their learning needs are, what their differences, what their similarities are, where that's something that's very upfront in the classroom. And so students will begin to reach out and support each other with some of those differences. It manages, what we call quote unquote behavior, but those normative processes in classrooms where it's like, we set up some agreements for, how we're going to behave with each other and how we're going to, be kind. Every classroom has them. What most teachers fall apart with is what happens when they don't get adhered to, right? What do we do about that? And when you build a classroom where students are really given a voice and really given an opportunity to both make those agreements, participate in them, and respond to each other when the agreements are broken in a group, not just in small groups, then you end up in a place where they will hold that container. They will help you hold that container. It's not just all on the adults, but then also it can be a really rich learning environment where students are very aware of their own learning needs and their own differences, and they will support each other.
Yes. So for those of us, you know what sociometry is, and I know what it is, but it occurs to me some listeners and viewers may not know what it is. Can you give us a capsulized version of what is this thing called sociometry?
Well, I mean, it literally means measurement of the socius or measurement of the group. So really that's what it is. It's a making explicit where we connect, where we have things in common, where our needs and our likes and dislikes, our experiences are similar, and where they are different and how they are different. And the more explicit that becomes, particularly in diverse groups, the more we can reach across those differences and understand those experiences, and also find our commonality, because those are the places we feel safest to connect, right? It's through
Yes.
it's with our differences that we struggle a little bit, but making all of that explicit eases that process and begins to build a container that is a place where people are, I don't think of it as a place that it's necessarily safe, because learning is risky and being in groups is risky. But you want a container where it feels like it's safe to take those risks.
I'm interested in that phrase. I almost want to write it down. Learning is risky. And so I'm interested, so your keynote will be anti-racist practices in schools,
Mhm,
sociometric tools that foster democracy in education.
mhm,
And I'm interested in an example
mhm.
about how this word sociometry can be actually applied to real life student, teacher, classroom experiences. Do you have a story that you can tell us right now?
Sure. So I just finished writing a chapter for a book called Colorizing Restorative Practices, and it will be released by Living Justice Press, maybe before the conference comes out. But this was about decolonizing schools. This was the major title of the chapter. And really what it was a series of stories of students that I had worked with. And I wrote it with actually one of my teachers. Um, and so I can give you, there are many, many stories, but we had in this one alternative school I worked in. So the last school that I was a principal of, and this is sort of a pathway in my career. I worked in two different types of schools, really. I worked in inner city schools. So those would be schools where the socioeconomic status of the students was quite low, where there's a high level of refugee and immigration. And then the other type of school I worked in Toronto, we call them alternative schools. I think in the US, they're usually charter schools. In Toronto, the alternative schools are free. There's no fee attached to going to them. They are public schools that, for the most part, were initiated and created by parents who wanted a specific kind of learning for their children. And the school board, kind of when the peak of the baby boom generation was leaving, often in the 70s and the early 80s, had space in public schools to offer these opportunities. And so one of the schools I worked in was called Alpha. It's a free democratic school, and based on Summerhill, which was the free school model, which is where children and adults work together to develop curriculum. I won't talk a lot about Alpha because it's not exactly that anymore, but it is a democratic school. It is a school that is very much run as everybody has a voice, right from the youngest child to every single parent. And no voice necessarily is louder than another voice. Like that's the model. Of course, in democracy, that doesn't always work, but we had a student who was sent to the school, really. He was in a behavior program in a regular school. He had been in a behavior program in a regular school, young Black boy. And we know from our research that particularly Black boys have been way overrepresented in special education programs generally, and in programs, at least in Toronto, in programs where behavior is the concern, right? So whatever kind of acting out. And it had gotten so bad in this behavior program that he had actually been removed from even a homeroom. And a tutor was being sent to his home to tutor him because they couldn't manage him in the classroom that he was in, even in a behavior program, which has no more than 8 students, a child and youth worker, and a teacher. So his aunt, who was a very strong advocate, went to the superintendent and said, this is not acceptable for this child. I want a school where he can attend. He needs to attend school. And she had researched Alpha and decided that she wanted him to be placed at Alpha. And he was going into grade 3, and so that's 8. And the superintendent was able to basically facilitate that transfer. Usually Alpha students are chosen by lottery, and they generally come in kindergarten. So he was added to the school. When he first came in, we were seeing a lot of inability to participate. He would, run around the school. The school's a free school, so the kids are allowed pretty free reign of the space. They're not, kind of contained in classrooms the way they would be in a regular school. And this young man did a lot of running around. And had a really hard time sitting. So one of the memories that I have is that at an all school meeting, which is where all the students were gathered to meet and discuss issues that were of concern to them. They created that agenda. He just couldn't sit, and he was like milling around everywhere. One of the things that we realized is that we had those meetings in the basement, and the kids would all be in a big lump facing the facilitators, the student facilitators. The student facilitators rotated, but they were not looking at each other. They were looking at the facilitator. And one of the democratic pieces is that we looked at this behavior from this one child, but also saw some fidgetiness and roaming around from a lot of the other kids. And we realized the problem here wasn't this kid. The problem was the structure of the meeting. And so we changed the meeting structure. We moved it to a bigger space where the kids could sit in a circle and look at each other. And that really shifted the whole thing. So it wasn't just that we were adjusting things for him. We were adjusting things for everybody, which is, really that universal design equity model, right? So then we we also were looking at his issues. A lot of times were, he would feel that he had been excluded or that he was being treated unfairly, and there would be explosive behavior as a result of that. One of the things that was amazing at Alpha as a democratic school is that kids, and this was something that I brought as well, because this is my expertise is restorative practices. So the concept that when there is conflict, when there is a problem, kids sit down in a very kind of formalized, they understand. Adults begin with the facilitation, and then kids take it over, looking at a series of questions. And it's not just the kids involved in the conflict that meet, it's the kids affected by the conflict. So when you think about that, it's either Cartman's triangle, or you can look at, Barbara Coloroso, the bullied, and the bystander, the victim, rescuer, and perpetrator. Like any of those, you want as many of those bystander people, the people who are not the direct victim, not the direct perpetrator, to be part of that circle, so that they can add, a less invested, less triggered, less defensive voice to the process. And so at Alpha, we had been doing that for a while. in a mediation setup, and we began to do it in a little bit more of a restorative setup, which grew the number of people involved and also focused less on who was to blame and focused on what had the harm that had been done and how could we heal that harm. And this young man was part of many, many circles with his peers. And one of the things that was amazing about Alpha Kids is that they were so, like they would do their thing, they would resolve it, and then the same thing might happen again. And generally they were really forgiving, right? They would just be like, okay, let's just do it, let's try again, let's do it. There was no kind of massive exclusion that would happen as a result. And so over a period of years, he learned, right, how to do that negotiation. The explosive episodes didn't necessarily stop, although they changed in nature. They got less violent, less extreme as he began to trust. The other thing that was really powerful that we did is that we invited, in every school, there are meetings about kids who struggle, right? That's what we do. We have meetings. And often we bring parents into those meetings. And in those meetings, often it's the school staff who lead the process, right? They make the statements about, what are the strengths, what are the needs, what are we doing? And the parents have a voice, but they're often just asking questions or observing. They're not really included often in the process. In their voice, their experience of their child is not really given a lot of space because often it contradicts with the school's experience, right? And one of the things that we did at Alpha in the way that we ran those exact same meetings, the structure was the same, the purpose was the same. However, we really, really involved their voice. And we had a number of meetings just with the teachers and myself without sort of the school board special education staff coming, that really just asked a lot of questions about their experience of this young man and what was happening at home, what were some concerns, what was he saying about school, and they had their own trauma as Black parents in school. And his aunt particularly was very articulate about her experience and about her fears for him. She also had a daughter as well. And we ended up bringing the daughter to Alpha later on. But one of the things that changed is their trust of the school system really radically changed, so that when there were issues, there was a willingness to hear, right? The defensive walls didn't go up immediately, right? And it's that sociometry of building trust, of looking very, very carefully at those opportunities for connection, those opportunities for leadership at elevating that experience. One of the things we did with this young man is that we, often when he'd blow up, we realized really quickly that dealing with it right away was not a good idea. He needed space. And one of the things we could do is we could give him a problem to solve. So he was very good with technology. So if at the class after that, often after lunch was often when things would happen, and it was silent reading for the whole school. So all the kids are reading, the little kids are being read to, and it's quiet in the building. But we're setting up for the next thing. And so if there was a technological problem we needed to solve, getting a projector going or making sure this set of Chromebooks would connect to the internet or that they would run this program, we would get him to solve that problem. And that would immediately raise his confidence. So then if he had to sit in committee later, which that's what we called our problem solving model in Alpha, with other students to discuss what had happened at lunch, he was in a better place, right? He had this positive experience. By the time this young man left the school, so that was 4 years later, he graduated in grade 6. We were able to remove he had a designation in his school file that he was a student with behavior issues, right? That's a particular designation. We were able to remove that from his IEP, from his individual education plan. In addition to that, we were able to, he had huge gaps in his learning, right? So there were very huge gaps, like 2-3 years behind in math, in language. I got to see him a lot in grade 7 and 8 because he was in a neighboring school where I was often, as a close colleague of mine who was the principal there, and I was often replacing her. And he was literally like you wouldn't have thought there was anything different about him. He was leading the basketball games. He was on all the teams. He was looked up to as a leader by the kids in that school. So there was just this transformative experience that happened for him. And he went to high school with, having completely caught up in terms of his academics, and being ready to start an academic program in grade 9, um, which was a huge achievement, given, his family history and given everything that had happened to him in the previous years. And the sociometry happened at every level, right? It happened with the kids, it happened with his family, it happened among the staff. We would often have staff meetings where we would bring the cases of students like this young man to the table. And really, our issue was not like it wasn't a complaint session. Really, it was a problem solving session. It was like, how do we adjust our program, the way we're working, the way we are talking to him, the way we're structuring his day in a way that's going to support him. So one of the things, he get frustrated in math because math was hard. So the teacher who taught math, he was often at the school early because his parents worked. And so he would walk himself to school at like 8:30. So she just started meeting him at 8:30 every day to tutor him in math, right? And there wasn't anybody looking at him. So he was able to have these private sessions so that when the problem solving sessions happened in class, he felt prepared, right? So these were the kinds of conversations we were having on a regular basis.
That is a beautiful story. It's inclusive,
Yeah.
it's inspiring. And I see that you gave the young person at least one new role, right? The
Yeah.
role of technological expert.
Yeah.
And how wonderful is to hear, because so often that kind of kid with those kinds of behavioral problems gets medicated,
Mm-hmm.
gets isolated,
Mm-hmm.
gets pushed aside,
Mm-hmm.
gets a certain reputation.
Yeah. Yeah. And he became a leader, right? Like that was the other thing I really
Mhm.
saw for him especially when he was in his intermediate school, which is a much more diverse population than Alpha. But he was a powerful leader. I watched him, and I watched him intervene often in conflicts, right? Because he'd learned so much at Alpha about how to negotiate, and figure out that process to manage conflict. And so he was often a leader in that process.
Thank you for telling that story. I want to talk just a little bit about your status in the
Mhm,
Moreno family.
mhm,
You are the daughter of Regina Moreno,
mhm,
who was a longtime teacher
mhm,
and educator. And you are the granddaughter of Florence Bridge Moreno,
mhm.
who was an educator for many
As well.
years, a very successful
Mhm,
educator. And of course, the granddaughter of Dr. J.L. Moreno, the man who developed psychodrama, sociometry, and group psychotherapy. And I wonder how it happened that you decided, I'm going to go into this. I am going to carry a piece of the legacy
That's a
forward.
that's a fun story. So I love kids, and I grew up in my mom's classroom. I often was very isolated as a child in school. I grew up, my early childhood until I was 11 or 12 was in a Midwestern city in Canada, named Calgary. And in that city, there was particularly a lot of racism against East Indians. And my father is East Indian. And my father, in addition to being East Indian, was a very left-wing political activist. My parents hit draft dodgers. There was a very, and Calgary is also politically is very conservative, like right of right. was in Western Canada, there was a political party called the Social Credit Party, which was like right of the conservatives that grew out of that sort of Western Canada world. And so I felt very much isolated and kind of a pariah in school. I was one of, in a school of 500 kids, I was one of maybe 3 children of color. One was a Sri Lankan boy, and then there were 2 half Jamaican kids, and maybe 1 child of Asian descent, right? We were, and so we were very, very much excluded. And in my mother's classrooms, I would go and there would be this whole new experience because I was the star. I was the daughter of the teacher, and my mother was a very, very highly regarded and well-loved teacher. And so it was a happy place for me to be in her classrooms. And I decided, that I wanted to work with kids and that I wanted to be a teacher in my 20s. And I was in my first classroom and I was really struggling. I was working in an inner city school in Toronto, and the kids just had so much trauma. And I was struggling to kind of get them to listen to me and get them to follow directions. It was some level of chaos. I didn't particularly like having the role of the adult. I didn't want to boss anybody around. And I had discovered a program that was called Tribes. And the person who wrote the book Tribes, Jeannie Gibbs, directly refers to sociometry. She refers to something called the sociometric test. And so she was coming out of Southern California, and for sure somebody had trained her. I don't know who, I don't know how that happened. I still don't know. But the book was written in the 70s, and a lot of it was the kinds of things we do in sociometry, which, we do a lot of exercises to get people to identify, where are we on a spectrum? What are our commonalities? What are our differences? And we, these were exercises you would do with students. And I had discovered this, and it was starting to change my teaching. And I talked to my mom about it. And my mom said, "Did you not know that that was your grandfather's work, that that's exactly what he did?" And I was like, "Really?" And I didn't, at that point, I was like, psychodrama was not my thing. It's like, nope, didn't want to do that. And I was surprised, but I started to look for some of those intersections. And at the same time, there was a teacher in the school who had actually taken some psychodrama workshops and knew Barbara Guest. Actually was they have actually kind of a bit of a family relationship. And we got stuck at a bus stop. We were waiting for the bus, and the bus was taking a really long time, and we started talking. And I mentioned that my grandfather was Moreno, and she just went all crazy and was like, "Oh my goodness, Barbara's my friend, and I've done these workshops," and it was this big kind of like conversation. And very shortly after that, I was like, I think, and she had mentioned Donna Little to me. And then I had a conversation with my Uncle Jonathan, and he had just come back from a conference where Donna had presented. And he said, "Donna's in Toronto. You should really connect with Donna." And my mother said the same thing. And I was like, okay, 3 times. 3 times somebody mentions the same person. I should do something about that. And so I phoned Donna, I reached out to her, and I said, I think we need to talk. And so I went to her house, which was an interesting story because it was very hard to find. And it was very hard to find Donna if you know Donna at all, that's not surprising. And we had this deep conversation, and I still remember her saying, "This is in your bones and it's in your blood, and it's going to come out no matter what you choose to do." I didn't formally become a student in psychodrama until a couple of years later, but that was the beginning to understand that the way that I needed to work as a teacher, as an educator, I was never going to be the kind of teacher who stood up at the front of the class and directed students. I just don't have the personality or the skill set to make that work. I had to be the kind of teacher that built a group. And so I became a tribes trainer. Actually, I trained many people in the school board. And then when it fell out of, a favor, mostly because of the name, I began to move into restorative practice, which again is just a sociometric. It's a sociometric set of tools that basically build groups and manage conflict. Practice being mostly in the educational setting. Although I did actually do some training where in a practicum where I worked in restorative justice. So, but my psychodrama training, always, I had said, I'm never gonna hang up a shingle as a therapist, right? That's not my thing. I'm an educator. And it's always been about, for me, always been about groups, understanding the process of that. The thing I love about education is that deep thinking, that opportunity to kind of go away from your kind of comfort zone. And that's why I'd say learning is risky, right? You have to be able to, you can't learn if you don't risk. And so that has always been my thing. And basically for me, I did my director's project on the Toronto Center as a sociometric center because it was run by a collective for the entire time it existed. And I looked at that in comparison with Who Shall Survive, which is my grandfather's text on sociometry as a tool for social change. And based on the work that he did in the Hudson School for Girls, largely. And I would say that was for me the thing. It was like if we could teach kids to believe that they can work together across these differences and manage these differences and understand difference and work through that process, then they could be engaged citizens in the world.
That is so fascinating. I feel like we could talk for a few more hours listening to your stories and hearing examples. And I want to say to our audience that if you want more of Miriam Zachariah and her ideas and her thoughts and her experiences, please come to the conference on April 2 to 7th, 2024. And if you can't come to the conference in Los Angeles, good news, because Miriam's keynote will be also virtual.
Mm-hmm.
It will.
Mm-hmm.
So you can still hear from her and hear more wonderful examples about sociometry and groups and inclusion and how it works. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.